Can you hear me? Is this fine? Okay. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to have been asked to serve on the board of the Inter-American Institute for Democracy and to address you tonight. I've always thought that perfecting democracy is key to Latin America's progress. I think all of us need to do our part in helping people in the region acquire a more effective voice in participating in matters that affect them and their countries. Now, the remarks that follow, I gave these about 10 years ago when I left the Foreign Service. I've updated the statistics in this presentation, but looking back on my 2009 speech, which I gave at Dartmouth College and at the University of Virginia, I find that almost all of the conclusions and observations remain relevant. So I hope what follows you'll find useful and interesting. And this audience, a lot of you, of course, are very familiar with the hemisphere and its issues, so forgive me if what I say is something you already know. But an awful lot of people know very little about Latin America, and that's the reason I produced this speech. I attended Dartmouth College in the early 1960s when few students studied or knew much about our southern hemisphere. When I was an undergraduate there, we were lucky to have John Sloan Dickey, who was one of the founders of the United Nations, as president, and Calman Silvert on the faculty. Both were committed internationalists, and they urged their students to consider public service. President Kennedy's call for us to ask not what we could do for our country, led me to spend my next 46 years in national and local government. Professor Silver got me interested in Latin America, but little did I know at the time that I would end up spending almost all of my life in Latin America. After graduation, I attended the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington and spent 2 years in Uruguay on a Fulbright scholarship studying the history of the left and labor there. And this is the book that I produced recently based on that research. After 4 years, I graduated and joined the Foreign Service and was assigned to El Salvador, which needed a vice consul urgently. I was one of the only ones in my entering class that spoke Spanish. So while most in my class studied Vietnamese, I drove south in my Camaro in 1970 to take up my first assignment in San Salvador. Waiting for me was a storeroom full of Salvadorian passports, those of people in line for a chance for a visa to go north to work. Of course, they said they were going for tourism. Early on, I was introduced to a key reality and constant in Latin America, that most people want to come here and will if they can, regardless of whether they get a visa or not. So I began a 38-year diplomatic career principally in Latin America, starting off as a lowly vice consul, bottom of the totem pole, and finishing up at the top as ambassador or the equivalent in Cuba and in Paraguay. In between, I served in Italy and Portugal and in 6 other countries in the region: Uruguay, Bolivia, Venezuela, Panama, Honduras, and Jamaica. And I also served in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Morocco. And I was Director of Hemispheric Regional Affairs and Political Advisor to the Atlantic Command, which at the time was responsible for the Caribbean region and Cuban migrant issues. When I retired at the end of September 2008, I was the U.S. diplomat with the most experience in the region. So I come here tonight to give you my personal reflections on how the region has changed since I first arrived in 1968, almost 50 years ago. I'll provide my observations about what has remained constant there, and this, of course, will be highly subjective, and it's based on what I saw and what I did there during and after the Cold War in my various jobs as political officer, consul, principal officer, trade promotion officer, political advisor to a 4-star general, and in my 13 years as Deputy Chief of Mission and then Chief of Mission in Havana and Asunción. To start, I should point out that it's hard to generalize about a region as large and as diverse as the Western Hemisphere. There are 6,000 miles between Laredo and Tierra del Fuego, 1,000 miles farther than from Paris to Beijing. So just as you would not expect uniformity in the area from Paris to China, you should expect there to be great differences in and among the countries to our south. We're really not even in agreement as to what to collectively call the countries to the south. It really can't be Latin America unless you exclude the English and Dutch-speaking Caribbean and all the indigenous peoples. So the region's really not identified or unified by a common language. While many countries in the region struggled for freedom from European governments and thus have that Bolivarian heritage in common, for the most part, the hemisphere is not unified, in my opinion, on any grounds, much less on language. I think experiences are for most part localized or regional, although there are growing aspirations and many experiments aimed at greater regional cooperation. But we're still a long way from hemispheric unity, even though the abstract ideal is universal. Unlike other parts of the world, for the most part, the hemisphere is firmly in the camp of Western civilization. We generally share the same values, principles, and religions. There are a few what I would call anthropological curiosities in the region. In many ways, the region is blessed. This was a region that tried its best to keep itself apart from Europe and its troubles until recently. We all studied and shared what used to be called the Western Hemisphere idea of a region separate from the disputes, hatreds, and religious intolerance and ethnic passions of Europe. That may not have occurred in reality, but it was our common ideal. Compared to other parts of the world, the Southern Hemisphere has few ethnic, religious, or contentious territorial disputes. The populations are young, with serious aging a la Europe not expected to be a real problem until 2025, although it is a problem today in Uruguay and Cuba. Terrorism is largely absent from the region, and people are appalled at suicide bombers. Except periodically for Brazil, most countries of the region are focused inward, or at best as far out as their near neighbors. They do not aspire to and do not play global roles in most significant areas. They don't want to be global leaders, but rather want to improve conditions in their neck of the woods. Economic development, social justice, institution building, and infrastructure improvements absorb their collective time and effort. Another general observation about the region is that it is still beset with great income disparities within countries and between regions. While some of this can be attributed to resource endowments or historical reasons, I think most of the differences are due to the differing quality of political leadership and economic policies over the years. The countries that have encouraged foreigners to take up residence and bring in their ideas, technology, and investment have done much better than more closed societies. Now, what has changed since I first entered the region in 1968 for the first time? I would probably need a couple days to do the theme justice, but I will mention 20 thematic areas, and I'll only be able to highlight the areas given time constraints. I think the most striking development is the notable improvement in standards of living for the vast majority of citizens. Infant mortality now is less than a third of what it was in 1968. And with the exception of Haiti, it's now the lowest of all the developing regions of the world. Mothers' mortality in childbirth is down sharply, declining by almost half between 1990 and 2015. Longevity has increased from 50 to nearly 80 years in many places, in other words, to our level, and literacy rates are up everywhere, with over 90% of children attending primary school in most countries. Most people now have access to electricity, potable water, roads, health clinics, and cell phones. Birth rates are also down sharply, and population growth is slowing in all but the poorest countries, which is a result of rapid urbanization and better education for women, I think. Poverty rates have dropped steeply as well in most places except in Haiti and Venezuela. When I arrived in El Salvador, the middle class was very small, but today most countries have a growing middle class. Their consumption is an increasing component of their economic growth. Also, immigration has accelerated tremendously in the past 4 decades, helped by improved infrastructure and transportation services in the region, which makes it possible for people to get to our borders and the borders of other magnet countries where jobs are more plentiful. Immigrant remittances today contribute tremendously to economic growth throughout the hemisphere. In 1970, when I got there, few U.S. airlines served the region, and road connections were still very bad. There were only 4 U.S. carriers authorized to fly south in 1970. With airline deregulation in 1978, it became much easier to fly to and from the region. Over 40 major airlines serve the region today, and 75.6 million people traveled to the United States in 2016. The U.S. Latin traffic is the fastest growing in the world. The ease of getting to the U.S. and our family-friendly immigration system are the reasons why today Latins are the fastest growing segment of our population. and will by 2065 number 78 million, over 24% of our population. When I first went south, democratic governments were rare. The military ran the show in most places. Presidents held most of the political power, with Congress relegated to a secondary role. Free and fair elections were uncommon. Political persecution of opponents was the norm. Human rights abuses were common. The end of the Cold War helped change this bleak panorama. The military had no training in running economies and did a terrible job. They too soon realized this fact and saw that their institutions were being corrupted from participation in politics, and so slowly began letting the civilians run the nations. Today, all countries in the hemisphere are democracies with the exception of Cuba and Venezuela, which are really run by their militaries. Elsewhere, the military is largely out of politics and are trying to professionalize. Many armies in the Southern Hemisphere are engaged in peacekeeping through the United Nations and in disaster mitigation. Parliaments and to some extent local governments have gained considerable power and frequently challenge presidential authority, as we see in Venezuela today. I think elections today are generally free and fair, and most governments invite in international observers to lend legitimacy to the process. And the human rights situation is greatly improved as well, again except in Cuba and Venezuela. The press and local human rights groups today speak out about abuses and press for an end of impunity. The end of military government has coincided with an end to the widespread insurgencies of the Cold War. Many insurgents in places like Uruguay, Nicaragua, Brazil, and El Salvador decided to participate in politics and have taken political power peacefully. Colombia's guerrillas may join this trend in the near future as well. I think a weakened Cuba also explains in part the drop-off in insurgencies and guerrilla activity. Cuba stimulated much of that, and with the end of Soviet support and the collapse of the Cuban economy, the Castros were no longer able to finance these improvements. Increased democratic legitimacy in most of the hemisphere also removed the root causes of much of the support for violent movements. We have seen the increasing participation of women in politics and a rapid growth in civil society over the past 50 years. Today there are over 1 million non-governmental organizations in the region. There were only 20 women in cabinets in 1970. Now women's presence in government ranges from 16 to 26% in Mexico, Central, and South America and the Caribbean. We have had many women presidents, and there are many females in most legislatures. I think these factors have also contributed to more democratic societies. There's a general clamor in the region today for a deepening of democracy, which is, after all, a process, a journey rather than a destination. I maintain that the hemisphere today enjoys electoral democracy, but few countries are really democratic in the sense that the majority can influence government decision-making. Elites still govern, and in most places do so for their own benefit or for the powerful groups they represent. The poor still rarely are heard or get their fair share of the economic or political pies. This explains another phenomena, the rise of radical authoritarian populism in response to the failure of the military, traditional parties, and old-style politicians to deliver the promises of democracy to society. Venezuela is a prime example of this. People expected their lives would improve dramatically with the end of military government in the Cold War. After all, politicians promised democracy would give them a bright future, a better education for their children, a job, and improved health care. While these did objectively improve, the old guard's venality and massive corruption frustrated the poor majority, and demagogic new leaders capitalized on this bitterness and frustration to use the new, more honest democratic institutions of government to take power and then remain in power. These new-style authoritarian rulers have used state resources to increase spending on the poor, but if anything, have proven to be more corrupt than those they replaced. And the economic policies they pursued have often ruined their economies and spurred massive inflation. People's expectations throughout the hemisphere still remain much higher than the ability of governments to meet them. From all parts of the hemisphere, people are immigrating in increasing numbers, not just to the U.S., but to Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, Europe, and even Japan and Australia, looking for the job and the better life their own countries can't deliver. Not counting refugees, there are well over 3 million Latin immigrants to those countries I just mentioned, and more than 50% of our flow of immigrants comes from the region. Latins today are increasingly traveling to and staying in Europe. And in fact, over 11 million people left the hemisphere for Europe recently. And when I last checked, departing planes to Europe were 85% full from Latin America. Lax and no visa requirements are a partial explanation, but Latin immigration to Europe, despite its current economic troubles, reflects as well greater job opportunities in an area of the world rapidly aging and in need of skilled labor. In addition to immigration, there's been a sustained movement of people from the countryside to cities in the past 50 years, as people search for a job and better living conditions. Today, Latin America and the Caribbean are urban societies. Lack of land is not the societal problem that it is in many other parts of the world. 10 years ago, 72% of the population lived in cities, and that percentage has now grown to 80%. The region is now home to two of the largest mega cities in the world, Sao Paulo and Mexico City. And the urban-rural divide is growing as people pour out of farms and the mountains for more exciting, hopeful, and inviting city life. The region is rapidly losing most of its jungles and forests to cattle, soy, and other grain grown on huge mechanized farms for export. You can see the environmental degradation everywhere. Wildlife is getting scarcer, loggers are hard at work, and the fishing, which is something I like to do, is deteriorating in most places. Indians are being squeezed and pushed farther back into the interior. Most of those farmers entering the cities lack the education and skills for successful urban life. With less than half of the primary school teachers having finished primary school, it's no wonder those immigrating to the cities are unprepared for the skills needed to prosper in modern urban settings. Many families are being broken up as one or both parents go abroad in search of work. And kids are left without guidance in many cities. The cities are beset by high population density, rapid urbanization, insufficient housing, and an inadequate transportation infrastructure, and persistent income inequalities and the inability of local governments to provide quality services. The result in many places is growing crime and insecurity. The rise of gangs, especially in Brazil, Venezuela, El Salvador, Honduras, and Jamaica. Over 40% of Latins say that they or a member of their families were a crime victim last year, and most crimes go unreported. The region is now the world's most violent. Latin America and the Caribbean hold only 8% of the world's population, but 37% of the world's homicides occur there. In a 2017 list that ranked the world's most violent cities, 43 out of the 50 cities were in Latin America. The list included 19 cities in Brazil, 8 cities in Mexico, and 7 cities in Venezuela. The murder rates are particularly high in Mexico, Guatemala, Venezuela, Honduras, El Salvador, and Rio de Janeiro. Caracas, Venezuela holds the dubious first place with 140 murders per 100,000 inhabitants. So throughout the region, you see gated communities everywhere with the high glass-topped walls around homes, and private guards are the ubiquitous response to overwhelmed, often corrupt police forces. In fact, the police in many cities are the criminals. At least that's the public perception. There are over 400,000 private security guards in Sao Paulo, but only about 100,000 police. This is the pattern in most countries. I think one of the causes of the rise of authoritarian government and public support for lynching and police killings in some cities is the government's inability to provide security. So often societies look for the quick fix and vote for strongmen who claim they will restore order and end the lawlessness that democracy supposedly unleashed. The crime explosion breeds distrust in government institutions, cynicism, and even renewed calls for military rule and death squads, as can be seen in the public support in Brazil for the film Elite Squad, which showed paramilitary squads offing favela gang members rather than arresting them. Of course, the economic impact of crime is huge and serves as a disincentive for investment. GDP might be 25% higher were it not for the expenditures on insurance and private security and guards, among other things in the region. On the positive side, you see today throughout the region numerous attempts at every level to integrate. Latins have created thousands of institutes, common market arrangements, and institutions to create larger, more efficient, and just markets and societies. Most of these may seem to outsiders to be mere talk shops, but slowly common frameworks are being established regionally, and increasingly ideas and experiences are being shared. You'll see energy integration is occurring, road networks are being connected, dams are being jointly built, and regional tariffs are coming down. These are helping regional export markets to grow. But much remains to be done for a true common market like Europe's to develop. What we see today are regional preferential arrangements like Mercosur, the Andean Pact, and CAFTA. As nations find mechanisms to integrate, we see an end to regional border disputes and armed conflict. Many borders have been fixed in the past 50 years. The Chilean-Argentine, the Ecuadorian-Peruvian, and the Honduran-El Salvadorian disputes have been settled. Only a few borders remain disputed, like that between Venezuela and Guyana, but the chances of armed conflict over them are small. Accompanying regional integration is the slow relative decline in the importance of the United States to the region. Our ability to dictate policy solutions certainly has diminished in the past half-century. Many governments do not accept the idea that big government is bad for the economy and society. They know that they have weak institutions, strong elites, and little practice of support for the underdog in their societies. After what they have seen of our inability to prevent financial abuses and corporate greed, they are loath to accept IMF and U.S. policy prescriptions for their society. You also see Brazil and Mexico aspiring to regional leadership. When its economy was strong, Brazil tried to play a leading role abroad, as did Venezuela when oil prices were soaring. Brazil, where my son lives and where I'm going next week, is a dynamic place with a frontier mentality and its own sort of manifest destiny idea to become the region's dominant country. China and Europe are big players in the region, unlike when I joined the Foreign Service in 1970. China in particular wants the region's commodities and is trading and investing vigorously there. Although we like to say the region is our backyard, we still give it little high-level attention. We've moved beyond the old Western Hemisphere idea that this is where we should focus our attention. But it may be that as we become more of a Latin society, our new citizens will force more of our attention back to their homelands. Before ending this rapid survey of the changes I have witnessed in the region, I'd like to briefly describe what has not changed much in these past 47 years. Governments in the region remain centralized, giving little autonomy, tax revenue, and inferior services to their interior areas. The elites remain reluctant to pay income tax and do their best to evade taxes of all types. They use the rationalization that government will just steal the taxes without providing better services. In general, Latin societies remain rigidly bureaucratic. Red tape hinders job creation and serves as a way for officials to supplement their official salaries. Corruption and impunity are widespread, and the ability of society and its weak democratic institutions to provide impartial justice and fight corruption remains woefully inadequate. As we are seeing in Brazil today, people are fed up with systemic corruption, but progress is slow. While electoral democracy is entrenched, real democracy is weak and the poor are excluded. Political leadership remains very poor everywhere. The young, the honest, and the dynamic eschew politics for business and traditional professions. While I mentioned earlier that the power of Congress has increased, the power of presidents in the region remains very high, and we are seeing a trend whereby many presidents seek to stay on past the constitutional limits by lobbying for constitutional amendments or simply ramming them through, as in Venezuela today. Social spending in the hemisphere remains deficient, and investment in roads and rural services is inadequate to keep people on the farms. Basic education remains poor, teachers are untrained, and governments overspend on universities for the elites. The urban-rural divide grows even larger, and it remains to be seen whether cities can keep up with providing the basic necessary services for their expanding populations. Economies are still largely based on commodity and people exports. The South exports grains, beef, and minerals, while the North exports people and some perishable winter vegetables. We're seeing an increasing specialization of Southern cone exports, with 61% of their exports now focused on around 10 products. The illegal alien boom that has allowed Mexican and Central American consumption to increase. Shopping centers abound in El Salvador and Tegucigalpa due to the huge inflows of immigrant remittances. They have some of the best shopping centers you'll see anywhere in the world. Remittances were just $2 billion when I arrived in the region. Now they're more than $60 billion and climbing. The region is number one in the world in remittance flows, and the United States is the largest source of remittance flows, with $56 billion sent abroad in 2014. But unfortunately, little of this goes to health and education or investment, outside the consumer sphere. Instead, it's used to pay for everyday consumption, although there are attempts to channel some of this to more productive uses. There's a real dearth of scientific research and innovation south of our border, and few patents are filed in the region. Latins are falling far behind the rest of the world in innovation, research, technical skills, and higher education. There's not a single university in the region in the list of the world's top 100 universities, and only 3 in the top 200. In a world where services and knowledge account for 2/3 of economic activity, Latin America cannot afford to keep ignoring this engine of growth. Not one university in Brazil, Argentina, or Mexico filed a U.S. patent from 1997 to 2001. And in 2015, more than 300,000 U.S. patent applications came from foreign applicants. But fewer than 2,000 patents came from Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina combined. Few scientific articles are published south of our border. South Korea alone spends more on research and development than all Latin America, and India has more graduate students in the U.S. than all the countries of the region. Even Brazil has only 20,000 students enrolled in graduate and undergraduate degree programs in the U.S. Standardized test scores in sciences and math are very low in the region compared with the U.S., not to mention the scores of those in Japan or elsewhere in Asia. You see that very few Latins qualify for the H-1B program, where we bring in temporary experts from the scientific communities abroad, which is another sign of the dearth of trained scientists there. Technologically, Brazil is better than the norm, especially in its use of the internet and e-government and energy and agricultural research. Most regional R&D is done by Brazilians. They're pioneers in biotechnology, like biofuels and gene research. Yet much of Brazilian R&D is done by multinationals and is focused on foreign product adaptation or improvement. The region lacks an entrepreneurial culture, which is a major impediment to growth and improved standards of living. Only in Chile, Brazil, Colombia, and parts of Mexico do we find many real, what I would call real entrepreneurs. Merchants and traders are everywhere, but not the business people willing to risk their money for a big idea. Generally, the entrepreneurs are immigrants or children of immigrants from entrepreneurial cultures like Germany, Japan, Italy, Lebanon, China, and the U.S. And much of the economic dynamism of the region emanates from ethnic enclaves. This is particularly true in Paraguay. All over Paraguay, you see enclaves of Chinese, Ukrainians, Canadians, Russians. And those are the areas that are the most prosperous and have the best economic performance. This lack of businessmen willing to take risk rather than rely on influence in the government to get contracts helps explain why the region's participation in world trade has been declining constantly over the last few decades. In Asia, the proportion of GDP due to trade has soared from 12% in 1950 to more than 27% in 2015. So is Latin America prepared for globalization? Can it compete? From what I've seen, unless it creates a climate and keeps it conducive to foreign investment and immigration, local technological innovation, and invests much more in basic education, it will remain reliant on a growth model very subject to external shocks. The innate talents of most of the population remain unrealized. I'm not optimistic that most of Latin America is ready for globalization or will adapt to it successfully. I'd like to conclude that by noting that in Latin America and the Caribbean remain objectively very important to the United States, and we should devote much more sustained attention to it. We have enormous trade and investment with the region. NAFTA now encompasses 2/3 of the GDP of the hemisphere. We buy much of our oil and minerals from the region, and most of our drugs and illegal immigrants are from the hemisphere. We have much in common in terms of values, religion, and liberal democratic aspirations. And our societies are fusing as the size of the Latin community in the United States grows ever larger. We need to work together to control crime, grow our economies, and keep terrorism from becoming a threat. And as a final thought, I hope that more college graduates from South Florida consider becoming career diplomats so that they can have the opportunity to help, like I did, shape events in the region and influence the direction of our policies. Diplomacy is a great and exciting career and a wonderful way to serve our nation. So thank you for listening.
Welcome to the Interamerican Institute for Democracy, Ambassador. And after this great presentation of the Ambassador Cason, Our director, Beatriz Angel, will make closing remarks.